Good morning. I am super excited to continue these Wednesday morning devotions with you. I'm excited to provide this time every Wednesday where we can gather, where you can take a few minutes to stop and sort of recharge yourself for the week. Hopefully, this is used as part of your own personal daily devotional time with God. For the next few weeks or so, as we start this devotional thing, we're going to be looking at commonly misunderstood Bible verses. Verses that are often thrown out and used out of context in our sort of daily lives. And what we mean by out of context is outside the original authors or the original speakers, whether it's somebody's letter or somebody has written down somebody's speech words, outside of what they meant. Outside of what the original authors, the original speakers of the passages actually were meaning and trying to say with those words. I loved memorizing scripture growing up at church camp. It was always a big part of my church camp experience. Was you'd have that time where you sat down and you memorized verses, and I was good at it. I was pretty good at memorizing those sorts of things. And I always recommend that for anybody who's studying scripture or doing daily devotions to start memorizing scriptures. But one problem I have with scripture memorization is a lot of times it's used, you memorize one verse out at a time. You take one verse, you pull it out of its context, the context it was written in, the speech or the letter that it was written in, and you memorize it, and then you use it for things that it was not intended to be used for, or intended to say. And so that's an issue that I have. So if you're going to be memorizing scripture, which I highly recommend you do, I always recommend memorizing chunks of scripture at a time. Multiple verses in one shot. It's this whole issue of taking verses out of context. It's why from the pulpit you rarely see me cover one or two verses at a time. And if I do, I'm always explaining the context that those verses were found in. So for the next 10 or so weeks, as we continue through these Wednesday devotions, we're going to look at the 10 most common pieces of scripture that are used out of context, that we as believers sometimes use to mean things that the original authors, the original speakers, didn't have those things to mean. And I want to be very clear, I'm not using this to attack anybody or to attack Christians as a whole who have these verses memorized and like to think of them in certain ways. What the purpose of this is to help each and every one of us better understand common scripture and the meaning for it that we have and the meaning for it that God has for us. This week, we are going to look at quite possibly one of the most popular memory verses of all time, a verse that is easy to take out of context and is 99% of the time, I would say, used in situations that are as wildly out of the context that Paul, the author of this specific verse, intended it to be used. But before we jump into that, I want to explain what context is for those of you who might wonder what I mean when I say that. Well, if you study Bibles, if you've attended our Bible study, when we covered the book of Revelation, we talked a lot about context. And context is the time a passage was written, who it was written to, why it was written, and what was actually being said for the people that it was written to. So this is any verse or any passage of scripture was written inside somebody's context. Paul or another author of a specific piece of scripture wrote that for a specific reason, for his own specific purpose, to a specific group of people so that they would understand a very specific thing. That's context. And usually, the good rule of thumb for context on any passage of scripture is to take the 4 verses that come before it and the 4 verses that come after it. And if you take the 4 before, the 4 after, plus the 1 verse you're looking at, inside of that, you have a pretty good context of what is actually being said and who it's actually being said to. But our verse today is, like I said, it's probably one of the most popular pieces of scripture that it gets used and misused often, and that's Philippians 4:13. It says, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." Before we jump in and start talking about it, let's read it in context. 4 verses before, 4 verses after. Let's read Philippians 4:9-17. This is what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me. Practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Yet it was kind of you to share my trouble. And you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving, except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. Now that I seek the gift, not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. Now, this verse, Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. I have heard it used in some really crazy situations. Probably the most popular way I've heard it used is when I was teaching, especially in the private Christian schools that I've taught in. Students would quote the scripture and pray real hard right before they would take a test that they neither studied nor prepared for. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength, they would say. Right before they would take a test, hoping that Christ would help them pass this test that they, again, didn't prepare or didn't study for at all. Students before sporting events would pray, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength, even, take my 5'8" self up against a 6'3" point guard and try to defend him. I've even heard coworkers, people that I've worked in ministry and in other jobs with, use this passage of scripture to deal with bosses, to deal with situations, to deal with people that they really don't like. I can deal with them because I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. The problem here with all of those different types and all the many ways we throw that verse outside of its context is that is not at all what Paul is saying here. He's absolutely not saying that with Christ, you can lift 200 pounds without practice or preparedness. He's absolutely not saying that you can pass a test without studying because Christ will give you the strength to do that. Or handle a person or a problem or a situation or a struggle because Christ will give you the strength to, be on the victorious side of whatever. This verse does not under any circumstances mean that you can do absolutely anything you want as long as you're a Christian and follower of Christ because he'll give you strength. You need to read the verse in context. And the context here is Paul is writing from prison. He's in prison. He's just written the majority of this letter to the church in Philippi, and he's kind of moving into his sort of closing conclusion of the letter. He's wrapping some stuff up here. He's in prison in Rome, an imprisonment that is going to end with his death. He's writing to this church in Philippi that at some point we see from the context that we read, those 4 verses before and 4 verses after, that they wish to help him. They have some concern for him in his current situation, but they can't seem to find a way to support him. And Paul thanks them for their concern and their desire to help him. But then he goes on to tell them that he didn't write this letter to them to drum up support. That he's not looking for support from them in that sense. That he thanks them for the offer. He thanks them for the help. And any help they do send him, he'll be grateful for because it's a benefit to them to help him spiritually. But that's not why he does what he does. That's not why he's writing this letter. Because he knows that whatever the situation he finds himself in, he has learned to be content. And that's what Philippians 4:13 is about. It's a passage about contentment. Being content no matter the situation you find yourself in, that no matter the situation Paul himself finds himself in, whether he's brought low or he abounds, no matter whether he finds himself hungry or well-fed, rich or poor, in abundance or in need, which is to say rich or poor, he has contentment because he knows that he can do all things through him who gives him strength. Not that he can do whatever he wants, lift a lot of weights or whatever that, but that no matter what the situation that he finds himself in, he can endure and he can handle it because of the person that gives him strength. Because Christ is there strengthening him. Christ is there with him. He isn't saying that because he can do anything he wants because Christ is with him and gives him strength, that he's going to break out of prison or do whatever comes into his mind. But that no matter the circumstances that Paul finds himself in, he is content because he knows that God will provide the strength he will need from the given situation, no matter what the given situation he finds himself in. This verse speaks to Paul's contentment in the midst of his hardship, his contentment that Christ is with him in the middle of his struggle and trials. And because of that, because Christ is with him, he knows no matter what happens, it's going to be okay. Philippians 4:13 is not a verse telling Christians that we can do whatever we want. It's not a verse that tells us that God will help us pass the test without studying, or deal with problem people, or give us wealth without work. It's a verse about finding contentment no matter the situation you find yourself in, because you know who Jesus is. And you know that no matter what the trial or the circumstance, whether you're healthy or you're sick or you're rich or you're poor or you're imprisoned or you're free, that through Christ we will be sustained in any circumstances. So remember, next time you read this verse, it's not about getting whatever you want. It's about being content with the situation that God has placed you in, being content where you find yourself. Have a great rest of the week.